Good morning. The Fuel Ethanol Workshop is always one of my favorite industry events each year because it's the largest annual gathering of the plant managers, shift supervisors, operators, lab technicians, maintenance techs, and other plant employees who get up and go to work every day to make fuel ethanol. At 200 plants scattered across the country, you work day in and day out to enhance our nation's energy security, improve the rural economy, and better the environment. So while I'm disappointed I cannot be with you in Indianapolis this morning, it is fitting that I'm speaking to you today from one of those 200 facilities. Today I'm at Southwest Iowa Renewable Energy, an RFA member plant in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And in just a few hours, the President of the United States will be here to help the ethanol industry and local farmers celebrate the finalization of regulatory amendments allowing the year-round sales of E15. Today will be remembered as a watershed moment for our industry, right up there with the day the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were signed into law, establishing the oxy-fuels requirement, or the day in August 2005 when President George W. Bush signed into law the Energy Policy Act, establishing the first ever renewable fuel standard, or the day in April 2006 when President Bush spoke to RFA's board of directors, celebrating the passage of the RFS-1 and laying out his vision for an even bolder renewable fuels program, or the day just a year and a half later when President Bush signed into law the greatly expanded and extended RFS-2. This is one of those days. The Renewable Fuels Association played a role in every one of those historic days for the ethanol industry, and we are proud to be involved in this milestone today. It is not an exaggeration to say that without President Trump's personal advocacy for year-round E15, it would not have happened. And we look forward to personally thanking him for keeping his promise to remove what he correctly called an unnecessary and ridiculous regulatory barrier that prohibited the summertime use of E15 in most of the country. President Trump understands that ethanol plants like Sire are important economic engines in rural America, supporting good-paying jobs and bolstering the farm economy. And he knows ethanol reduces prices at the pump, plays a key role in American energy dominance, and helps clean the air we breathe. He also knows that outdated government regulations too often impede economic growth and innovation, and the summertime ban on E15 was a perfect example of the antiquated regulatory barriers that need reformed because they offer no economic or environmental benefit whatsoever. So while I am sad to miss the Fuel Ethanol Workshop for the first time in 11 years, I am thrilled to be here to welcome the President to one of the plants where ethanol is made and to thank him for his commitment to renewable fuels and the American farmer. The approval of year-round E15 sends an incredibly important signal about future market opportunities for ethanol, and EPA's final rule is the key that finally unlocks the door to long-term growth in the domestic market. By allowing E15 to be used year-round, EPA is finally removing the single most challenging barrier that had prevented many retailers from investing in E15 and other higher ethanol blends. It's also a shot in the arm for farmers hard hit by Mother Nature and trade uncertainty this year. Of course, the oil industry is not happy with this decision, and they have already challenged President Trump in court over this action. In fact, they filed their petition just yesterday, the first day they were allowed to do so. But we are confident the oil industry and any other challengers will lose. They will likely pursue a preliminary injunction to immediately halt the summertime E15 sales and prevent the rule from going into effect while the court case is heard. But there's a very high bar for that type of injunctive relief. Petitioners will not only have to show a likelihood of success on the merits, but they will also have to show that implementation of the rule would cause, quote, irreparable harm. Both of those will be difficult, if not impossible, for the oil industry to show. How can big oil's attorneys demonstrate irreparable harm when this rule simply makes E15 an option for retailers and a choice for consumers? This is not a mandate. Ethanol is less expensive than gasoline today, and blending more of a lower cost, higher octane fuel does not create economic harm for anyone. To the contrary, it creates economic opportunity. We have no doubt that EPA will prevail in court. The oil industry's legal challenge to President Trump's common sense approach on E15 will fail miserably, legally and politically. Now, it is important to keep in mind that year-round use of E15 is not a silver bullet to prosperity in the industry. It will take time for the market to adopt E15 more broadly. The near-term impacts of the E15 rule will be modest. We've never suggested otherwise, but it does set us up for growth in the long term. That's the certainty and market signal we need right now. But again, year-round E15 is not a cure-all for the demand destruction we have suffered as a result of EPA letting so-called small refiners out of their legal obligations to blend renewable fuels under the RFS. EPA's abuse of its small refiner waiver authority over the past 2 years has robbed the ethanol industry and farmers of more than 2.6 billion gallons of demand under the RFS. EPA gave out 54 waivers to small refiners, allowing them to ignore their RFS obligations in 2016 and 2017. And it wasn't just small mom and pop refining companies that received EPA bailouts. It was also companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron. Now, some have argued the small refiner exemptions have not affected the industry because ethanol production levels have remained relatively stable. That's nonsense. While ethanol supply levels indeed reached record heights in 2018, they're ignoring the fact that demand has softened, and we've seen record surpluses for ethanol. In 2018, we saw both the volume of ethanol blended into U.S. gasoline and the ethanol blend rate drop from 2017 levels. That was the first time we'd seen an annual decrease in domestic ethanol blending in 2 decades. And worse, in the wake of softer demand, ethanol prices were forced to adjust lower to maintain attractive blending economics and keep our spot in America's gas tank. How does that make sense? Ethanol is higher octane, it is cleaner than gasoline, it's made in America, and it reduces carbon emissions from our transportation sector. Ethanol is a premium product, so why does ethanol need a steep discount to gasoline in order to preserve its market share? I'll tell you why. Because the transportation fuel market is not a free marketplace. The market is broken. And that's exactly why the renewable fuel standard remains critically important. The bottom line is EPA's abuse of the small refiner exemption provisions has got to stop. EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, who will be here today with the President, is currently reviewing petitions for another 39 small refinery waivers. We will continue to do everything in our power to discourage Administrator Wheeler from giving out exemptions to more refiners who are unable to prove they qualify. And we are suing EPA in 3 separate actions to put an end to this madness. We simply cannot afford another year of demand destruction at the hands of these EPA waivers. After years of demand destruction, it is past time for a recommitment to demand creation, envisioned by Congress when it passed the RFS with overwhelming bipartisan support and expanded it 2 years later. The point of the renewable fuel standard was always to lower our dependence on petroleum, to create value-added markets for farmers, and to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. The RFS has been a success on every front. A recent analysis by renowned oil industry economist Phil Verliger, whose clients have included some of the biggest oil companies in the world, recently found that the RFS itself has reduced U.S. gas prices by an average of 22 cents per gallon. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has determined that ethanol produced at dry mill ethanol plants reduces carbon emissions by an average of 43% compared to gasoline, even when speculative land use change emissions are considered. And the ethanol industry continues to generate significant economic activity, supporting 365,000 jobs across the country, adding $46 billion in gross domestic product, $25 billion in household income, and turning a $4 bushel of corn into $6 of value-added ethanol, feed, and industrial products. EPA will soon have an opportunity to set the RFS on firmer footing moving forward. Later this summer, we expect the agency to issue the so-called reset regulation that will adjust RFS volumes for 2021 and 2022. The reset rule was triggered by the fact that advanced and cellulosic biofuel production has consistently fallen short of the congressionally mandated volumes under the RFS. So now the agency must adjust future RFS volumes to reflect its view of what production levels are possible moving forward. But production of conventional biofuels like corn ethanol has not ever fallen short of the congressionally mandated levels, and in fact, the industry has typically produced volumes well above the RFS requirements. In the past, even former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt has acknowledged the agency has the authority to expand the requirement for conventional biofuels like corn ethanol beyond 15 billion gallons in a reset rule. That's exactly what the agency should do. The reset rule is EPA's chance to make things right, to restore all that required blending volume that it took away from the biofuels industry. Think about this. 2013 was the last year that EPA enforced the statutory RFS requirement for conventional biofuels. Every year since then, ill-founded and illegal waivers, exemptions, and bailouts have eroded the standards. We've lost a combined total of 4 billion gallons of required RFS blending since 2014. It's time to restore that lost demand, and EPA could and should do so through the reset rule by simply adding the previously exempted volume to the 2021 and 2022 RFS requirements. The RFA will also continue to focus on building demand through increased exports. We have seen great strides in international market development over the past decade. In 2009, we exported just 110 million gallons of ethanol. That's less than Sire is producing in a year. 10 years later, in 2018, we exported 1.7 billion gallons of ethanol, or about 11% of our total industry output. That growth has been driven in large part by our sustained efforts with the U.S. Grains Council, USDA, corn grower organizations, and other partners. But in reality, when ethanol is given the opportunity, the product practically sells itself on the world market. It is by far the most cost competitive and cleanest source of octane available today, and countries around the world are catching on. Despite the current long odds, we remain optimistic that there will be a trade agreement with China that will reopen that market to U.S. ethanol. Before China decided to impose ridiculously high tariffs, it had been our fastest growing export market. China remains committed to implementing a nationwide E10 blending requirement in the years ahead, and thus that market holds vast potential as a top export destination for U.S. ethanol. Reopening the Chinese market remains our highest trade priority. Finally, as RFA looks toward the future, we recognize there are major challenges and significant uncertainty. Some of that uncertainty stems from the fact that in 2023, EPA is no longer constrained by congressionally mandated volumes for the RFS, and they will set future volumes based on amorphous and somewhat subjective criteria. But you should take comfort in the fact that our product, the product you're making every day, does something that no other liquid fuel on the planet can do as effectively or affordably. Ethanol significantly boosts octane, displacing toxic aromatics. And secondly, ethanol significantly reduces carbon emissions. Clean octane and carbon reduction are ethanol's two secret weapons, and we know that future growth for ethanol will be tied to those two attributes. We need to focus our energies on building future policy solutions around those two unique properties. We also know that there are more regulatory barriers that will impede the future growth of fuel ethanol. We need to address all of those barriers, just as today President Trump is addressing the former RVP barrier that was keeping E15 out of the market in the summertime. All we're asking for is to be able to compete on a level playing field. One of the important planks in the bridge to the future is flex fuel vehicles. We need to be doing everything we can as an industry to ensure that automakers continue to increase, not decrease, their production of FFVs, capable of running on blends from E0 to E85. That's why I would encourage everyone at the Fuel Ethanol Workshop to seek out Chris Schwark, Rick Schwark, or Paul Camp during the workshop. Ask to sign an important petition that they have started, or just stop by RFA's booth number 701 for more information on that effort. The RFA continues to work with corn growers and other industry partners to lay out a vision for future growth that is focused on ethanol's tremendous high octane, low carbon benefits. We want and need your participation in that process. We cannot sit back and allow future policy to be dictated by those who lack the vision to see the potential of renewable fuels, or those who are blind to the need to address carbon emissions from transportation fuels. Let me conclude by saying today is a phenomenal day in the history of the ethanol industry. It's not every day the President of the United States stops by an ethanol plant to celebrate a major victory, but that's about what is to happen here in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And at the same time, you all are gathered in Indianapolis learning about the newest technologies, best practices, and efficiencies that will drive our fantastic industry to even greater heights in the future. I can't wait to see what that future holds for all of us. Thank you very much and enjoy the Fuel Ethanol Workshop.